And there's a way to utilize IEP meetings and transition goals under the law, as Dennis has described, to make sure that those students know their rights, know how to use them, and know how to file complaints or figure out how to fix things around them through self-advocacy when those rights aren't being followed. So the next slide talks about IEP meetings specifically. As Dennis talked about, in the past, there was this knee-jerk reaction to say OVR will take care of the transition, or some other agency. And there are lots of ways to integrate the agencies together, to integrate all these supports and resources for our students together instead of just punting the ball to the next person. One way to do that is in an IEP meeting, if the student is eligible for OVR, to actually invite the OVR office or support person to the IEP meetings. In Pennsylvania, OVR is the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. This may be called something different in your state. I know we have people joining us from around the country, but you can call the Client Assistance Program at the U.S. Department of Education to find out who in your state is the contact person. In 2014, the United States passed a national law that requires 15% of a state's OVR funding to be used for pre-employment transition services, specifically for children who have IEPs or 504 plans. And this is something that a lot of people don't know about, that funding is there, that in many states it's sitting there unused. So instead of being siloed, instead of having the school district say OVR is taking care of that, or OVR say the school district's taking care of that, what we're saying here is integrate these teams of people who are supporting your student into the IEP meetings. Utilize the fact that this law has been passed that requires everyone to talk to each other and get them in the room together. When you're looking at the goals themselves, I know so many students that we work with, I've sat in a room with, and they've said, I have an ISP, I have an IEP, I have an IPE, I have all these services and all these plans and all these people supporting me, and yet I don't feel like I'm moving towards what I want to do. And I think that's so often because those plans aren't integrated and the people working on those different plans aren't talking to each other. So utilize the IEP meetings, utilize the IEP transition goals, utilize those pre-employment transition services that are provided by agencies like the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, to get everyone in a room, get them into the IEP, and make sure that people are talking to each other and the student and the family and moving forward with transition. The last thing to note on that is just that pre-employment transition services are not only available to students who have been found eligible for vocational rehabilitation. Those are available to any student who has a 504 plan or an IEP. On the next slide, we talk about transition goals. Dennis has given some good tips on transition goals in general, and I know if you look on our website under our MLO minutes, you'll find some excellent articles about what different transition goals can look like. Specifically, what I would like to encourage everyone to do is to utilize those goals to empower students to self-advocate. It's a requirement under the IDEA. It's a requirement in many of our state regs to utilize transition goals, transition services to teach students how to self-advocate. And what I mean by that is how can we use the IEP, how can we use the special education and really embed civil rights education there so that when students go into employment or when students go into an educational setting, they know what their rights are as a person with a disability and they know how to get the supports and accommodations and adjustments that they're entitled to. Just this week I was looking over some really great transition plans in an IEP, and I just wanted to note a few things that I think could be really seen as best practices. Number one, we're not just restating academic skills. So a transition plan should not just say increase reading skills, increase arithmetic capabilities, increase social skills. They need to be much more specific than that. For a student who is specifically looking at employment post-graduation from high school, you could include goals like creating a resume, creating a job application, or completing a job application independently. Familiarity with forms that one would need to fill out if there was some sort of disability discrimination going on in the workplace. Similarly, for students who are looking at some sort of post-secondary education, which could be a college, a university, or a vocational program, you might think about having goals and services around how do you create an academic adjustment request. We're going to talk more about what that means. How do you identify campus supports for students with disabilities? And how do you familiarize yourself also with that complaint system, which could be, we'll talk about more, could be at the school's own level or going up to the U.S. Department of Education and their Office for Civil Rights and making sure that those student rights are being enforced. So once your student has gotten through those transition meetings, you've implemented these IEPs over years, and we're ready to move on to a student who's ready to move on to post-secondary education, what did those rights look like? So we all know that the rights under the IDEA do not follow a student to post-secondary education. But what's sometimes forgotten is that students hold on to a lot of rights under Section 504 to those post-secondary education opportunities. While this means a student doesn't have any right to a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education, anymore, it does mean that the student has a right to appropriate academic adjustments, to accessible housing and programming, and a right to be free from disability discrimination. So let's talk on the next slide about what is an academic adjustment. Students with disabilities who are in a post-secondary setting who meet the academic and technical standards for admission to a program can receive academic modifications and auxiliary aids to ensure that they're able to equitably participate in the program. Sometimes you'll hear these called academic accommodations, but that's a misnomer. They're actually called academic adjustments at the post-secondary level, and that's just an important term of art to remember, because sometimes if you're looking online or you call into the school and say, I need help with academic accommodations, you might not get anywhere or to the right place. So again, at the post-collegiate level or the post-secondary level, these are called academic adjustments. How does the school determine what is an appropriate academic adjustment? Just like when we're looking at goals and IEPs and services in high school, at the collegiate level, those must be determined based on the individual and based on that individual's disability. They might, as I said, include auxiliary aids or services. They might also include modifications. A school is not required to lower essential requirements. Schools are not allowed to fundamentally alter their program or their services in order to provide these academic adjustments, but students are entitled to them. On the next slide, I give some examples of what an academic adjustment looks like. It could be priority registration, extra time, or a quiet room for exams, or a variety of different academic adjustments that I've put there. What academic adjustments are not does not include things like personal devices like wheelchairs, a personal service like an aid. As I said, there's no fundamental alteration of classes or program. The other important thing to remember is that you're not entitled to the best or most expensive academic adjustment or even best practices. The requirement is an effective adjustment. Consideration, of course, should be given to the student's preference, but a school can reject a student's choice and offer them an equally effective alternative. The other thing to remember about academic adjustments is, unlike when you're in a K-12 setting and the school is responsible and under law supposed to be finding students, identifying what their needs are, and identifying those with disabilities, once you're at that post-secondary level, the onus is on the students. You have to raise your hand and say, "Hi, university, I am here, I have a disability, and these are the academic adjustments that I'd like to talk to you about." You have to go into those offices, you have to make those phone calls. They're not going to identify you based on your high school record, which again, I think reflects back on why those transition goals in the IEP and teaching self-advocacy is so important as we're doing transition planning. Another right on the next slide that we talk about that students with disabilities have in the post-secondary level is accessibility of programs, services, and facilities. That means that no one should be telling a student, "Oh, I'm sorry, you can't take chemistry because our chemistry lab is in the second floor of a building that doesn't have an elevator and you're a wheelchair user." It also means that students who utilize something like a screen reader to be able to access the internet or computer programmings should also be able to access any university websites, web postings, and web-based courses. That would include, for example, if your class, your professor utilizes a Facebook page for the class where they post videos on it. Those videos should be accessible to students, for example, who have a hearing impairment. We would expect to see closed captioning on those. So as technology evolves and changes, we continue to get to be able to apply these old laws to new technology to protect students with disabilities. So if you're in a school and you've requested an academic adjustment and been denied, if you are unable to access parts of campus the same way that other students are, or you're having issues with housing, where do you go? What do you do when discrimination occurs? The first place to go is always the place that's close to you. Every education institution is required to have a person who coordinates compliance with these civil rights laws. That's sometimes called a 504 coordinator, an ADA coordinator, or the Disability Services Center. The school should have grievance procedures in their own materials, frequently on the website or in some sort of student handbook that tells you how to appeal to the school when disability discrimination is occurring. And if none of that works, the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, more than half of the cases that they see every year are around academic adjustments and program accessibility. So they have forms that we've linked to on the presentation that you've been provided if you're unable to get the school to work through those issues with you. So for some of our students, they're not going to go to a post-secondary institution, or they're doing both. They're going to go to school and they're also looking for jobs. So we're going to talk a little bit about what employment protections are provided for our students as they transition into the workplace and into the adult world under the ADA.
Nancy, may I interject for a moment
Absolutely.
and answer a few questions
Sure.
that we had? That'll also give you time to catch your breath. A question that we received is with regard to students with dyslexia. What are the best ways to be tested prior to college? What we have found is that colleges are generally looking for two things with regard to providing accommodations for